August 3, 1943. Sicily. The sun beat down like a hammer on the canvas roof of the 15th Evacuation Hospital. Inside, the air was thick, heavy, and almost impossible to breathe. It smelled of iodine, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood that had dried on bandages and uniforms. Flies buzzed lazily over the stretchers. Men groaned and cried quietly, some whispering prayers, others muttering in pain. The heat was unbearable. The tent was a furnace, trapping every sound, every smell, every emotion. Amid this chaos, a figure appeared. General Georges Patton. He moved like a storm. Polished helmet gleaming, riding breeches tight and spotless, ivory-handled revolvers glinting at his hips. Every step he took seemed to command the tent itself. Soldiers looked up. Nurses froze. Doctors stopped their work mid-stitch. Patton did not just enter a room, he claimed it. His presence alone made the air sharper, heavier, electric with tension. Patton loved war. He loved glory. He loved men who bled for him. He loved the smell of courage almost as much as he loved the smell of gunpowder. But today he was looking for something else. Something more. He walked slowly down the rows of beds, nodding at the wounded, asking simple questions about their injuries. Most answered bravely, smiling through the pain, proud to show their scars. Patton smiled back. This was his kind of theater, the play of war he understood perfectly. And then he saw him. Private Charles H. Cool. The boy was sitting alone on a supply box, shivering under the heat. No blood. No bandages. No visible injury. Just a young man trembling as if the weight of the world was pressing down on his small shoulders. His head was bowed. His eyes avoided Patton's. The general's shadow stretched long across the tent and swallowed the boy whole. Patton paused, studying him. He leaned closer. "Where are you hurt, son?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was an edge in it, a danger that made everyone in the tent hold their breath. The boy mumbled. His voice barely carried over the groans of the wounded. I guess I just can't take it." Silence. The groaning faded. The stitching stopped. Even the flies seemed to pause in midair. Everyone watched, frozen. The entire tent became a stage for a moment that none would ever forget. Patton's face changed. First confusion. Then disbelief. Then suddenly rage. Pure, burning, unrelenting rage. He did not see a sick boy. He saw weakness. Cowardice. A virus that could infect the entire army if allowed to live. Patton's hand shot out before anyone could blink. The sound echoed like a gunshot. His gloves struck Private Cool across the face. Art. The boy's helmet liner flew off, and he began to sob, small, choking sounds that made the tension even heavier. The doctor stepped back. The nurses gasped. The other soldiers stared, frozen by fear. No one moved. No one dared. The heat, the smell, the tension, they all seemed to amplify the moment. Patton grabbed Cool by the collar, lifting him up so their faces were inches apart. "I won't have a yellow-bellied coward sitting here crying," he shouted. His voice cracked, trembling with fury. "You're going back to the front lines. You may get shot. You may die. But you are going to fight." The boy shook, tears running down his cheeks. Everyone feared the next move. Was Patton going to go too far? Could he really harm one of his own men in the middle of a hospital? Patton let him drop back to the box. His hand lingered near the ivory handle of his revolver. For a second, everyone in the tent imagined the unthinkable. But then Patton stepped back, breathing hard, eyes wild with fire. He turned on the staff, shouting at the doctors not to admit the boy. There was no shell shock, he declared. It was an invention. A lie. Weakness had no place here. And with that, Patton stormed out, kicking a pile of discarded bandages as he left. The tent flap swung shut behind him. Silence returned, heavier than before. The heat pressed down. The flies resumed their buzzing. But the echo of that slap, the cry of the boy, and the fear of everyone present lingered like smoke in the air. Private Cool sat on the supply box, trembling, tears dripping, heart racing. He would go back to his unit, but he was not alone in fear. The other soldiers whispered, exchanging nervous glances. Everyone had seen the general's fury. Everyone had felt it. And everyone wondered, what would happen next? Outside the tent, the Mediterranean sun blazed. Inside, in the heat, the war felt closer than ever. Not the distant battles against the Germans, but the war of men against men. Discipline against fear. Glory against weakness. And in the middle of it all, Patton walked away, a storm in human form, leaving silence and terror behind. The war had begun not just on the battlefield but in that tent. And the question on everyone's mind was simple: what would Patton do next? And who would survive it? The tent was quiet. Too quiet. Even the moans of the wounded seemed to shrink under the weight of what had just happened. Private Charles Cool's tears ran down his face as he held his cheek, still burning from Patton's glove. His mind raced. He had survived battles, artillery fire, and the relentless heat of Sicily, but never humiliation like this. Doctors and nurses exchanged worried glances. Colonel Donald Courier, the hospital doctor, stepped forward, hands trembling. "Sir, maybe we should," he began, but Patton's voice cut him off like a whip. "No," Patton bellowed. "This man does not need pity. He needs to fight. I will not have cowards sitting in my hospitals. Get him out. He will return to the line whether he likes it or not." The boy swallowed hard, trying to calm himself, but his body shook uncontrollably. The temperature in the tent felt higher now, the heat mixing with fear and tension. The other soldiers watched silently, knowing that anyone who spoke could become the next target of Patton's wrath. Patton moved on, inspecting the rows of men lying on cots and stretchers. He asked questions, handed out cigarettes, nodded at the brave soldiers, but his eyes were always searching. Searching for weakness, for any sign that a man would falter in battle. The fear in the tent was palpable. Even the strongest men felt it. And then he saw him. Private Paul G. Bennett. Young, pale, and trembling, he sat huddled on a cot, eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing. He had witnessed horrors no young man should ever see, friends decapitated by artillery, screams that would haunt him forever. And now, he trembled under the gaze of the man who demanded courage above all else. Patton's shadow fell over him. "What is your trouble, son?" he asked, deceptively calm. Bennett's voice barely carried. "It's my nerves, sir. I can't stand the shelling anymore." For a heartbeat, silence fell again. Then Patton's calm evaporated like morning mist. His face turned red. His eyes bulged. Rage, pure and uncontrollable, filled the tent. "Your nerves?" he screamed. "You yellow coward. You are a disgrace to this army." And before anyone could react, Patton struck Bennett with a heavy open-handed slap. The boy's head snapped back, tears streaming down his face. He began to cry, small helpless sobs that filled the tent with sound. Patton grabbed him by the collar, shaking him. "Shut up," he roared. "You are going back to the front. You may die, but you will fight. If you don't, I will see that you pay for your cowardice myself." The nurses gasped. The doctors froze. Colonel Charles B. Eder, the hospital commander, stood silently, horrified. For a moment, the rules of war seemed to vanish. In the medical tent, violence was supposed to stop. Here it raged unchecked. Patton's hand dropped near his revolver, the ivory handle glinting under the hot Sicilian sun. Every soldier present feared the unthinkable. But then, just as suddenly as it began, Patton spun on the medical staff. "Do not admit him," he shouted. "Throw him out. There is no room here for weakness. You hear me?" Bennett collapsed back onto the cot, trembling and gasping for air. Patton stormed out of the tent, kicking a pile of dirty bandages. The flap slammed shut behind him. The heat returned. The flies returned. The silence, however, remained. It was heavy, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. Outside, the Mediterranean sun glared down like a judgment. Inside, soldiers whispered. Some were angry. Some were afraid. All were shocked. Private Cool, who had witnessed Patton's first outburst, now understood that this man's fury was not a simple temper. It was a force of nature, terrifying and unstoppable. But the story did not end with just these two soldiers. Weeks would pass, and Patton's reputation in the army would become even more complicated. Reports from the medical tents began to trickle upward through the chain of command. His behavior, slapping soldiers, shouting at them, threatening violence, was noted in official papers. Some feared he had gone too far. Others, strangely, saw him as necessary, as a man willing to enforce discipline no one else could. The pressure in Sicily was unbearable. Patton and the other generals were racing for Messina, the final objective on the island. The British, led by Montgomery, moved carefully and methodically. Patton, wild and impulsive, pushed his men harder than any commander before him. He believed in speed. He believed in attack. He believed that any hesitation was betrayal. Every man who faltered was a threat to the mission, and to his glory. Private Cool and Private Bennett were not the only ones caught in this storm. Every soldier in the 7th Army felt the weight of Patton's wrath. Yet, amid fear there was also a strange respect. Men whispered that Patton's fury, terrifying as it was, came from a place of obsession with victory. He did not want to see them die slowly in battle. He wanted them to fight, survive, and win. And then came the letters. Reports from the hospitals reached the top commanders. Eisenhower himself read the accounts, the slaps, the screams, the threats. The man who led the greatest army in the world was behaving like a madman. Would Patton be punished? Could he be stopped? Or was his madness a necessary evil to save the Allies from failure? The soldiers waited. The doctors waited. And in the background, Patton moved on, unstoppable, leaving fear and confusion behind. And for Private Cool and Private Bennett, the war had just begun. Not the war against the Germans, but the war of surviving under a general who demanded courage at any cost, and was willing to strike those who faltered. Cliffhanger for Part 3. Reports reach Eisenhower. The man who controls the fate of the Allied armies must decide: keep Patton or destroy him. The decision could change the course of the war. Weeks had passed since the shocking events at the 15th Evacuation Hospital in Sicily. Soldiers whispered about the slaps, the screams, and the terror Patton had unleashed on Private Cool and Private Bennett. But news travels slowly in a war zone, and now it was moving faster than anyone expected. Reports had begun their journey up the chain of command, landing on the desk of the man who held the fate of the entire Allied effort in his hands, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower sat in his office at Allied headquarters, staring out the window at the Mediterranean coastline. The war was a storm all around him. French politics, British pride, American inexperience, and German aggression pressed on him from all sides. And now, in the midst of this chaos, he faced a problem of his own making, or at least one he had allowed to grow unchecked. Colonel Etter's report lay before him. It was precise, horrifying, and impossible to ignore. He read the details slowly, his brow furrowing with each line. The quotes were staggering. "Yellow-bellied bastard," Patton had shouted. "I'll shoot you myself." The reports described two soldiers, both trembling, both crying, both thrown back into the heat of battle. And all because the general believed their fear was a crime. Eisenhower leaned back in his chair. He was not a man easily shaken. Years of diplomacy, strategy, and command had taught him the value of calm. But even he understood the gravity of this situation. Patton was not just any general. He was a force of nature, a warrior who could inspire terror in the Germans and courage in his men. But he was also a man who could destroy everything the Allies were trying to build with a single reckless act. The room was silent except for the faint scratching of a pen as Eisenhower made notes in the margins of the report. He thought carefully. The regulations were clear. Striking a subordinate was a court-martial offense. He could remove Patton from command immediately. He could send him home in disgrace. It would be the safe, simple choice. But the consequences? Possibly catastrophic. Patton was more than a general. He was the sharpest weapon the Allies had. Removing him now would hand the Germans an advantage they could not ignore. They feared Patton more than any other American commander. Eisenhower knew it. He could almost hear Hitler laughing if news of Patton's dismissal reached Berlin. To fire him would be to weaken the army at the worst possible moment. The decision weighed on Eisenhower like a mountain. Discipline demanded one course of action. Strategy demanded another. The choice was a knife's edge and he had to walk it perfectly. He put the report down and picked up a clean sheet of paper. He would not make a public example of Patton. No newspapers. No telegrams. Not yet. This was a private matter and he intended to keep it that way. He began to dictate a letter, careful, deliberate, each word chosen to cut deeper than any scream Patton had ever let loose. "I am questioning your judgment," Eisenhower wrote. "I do not expect you to be perfect, but I do expect you to be fair. I understand the necessity of hardness on the battlefield. I understand firm measures are required to secure objectives. But brutality, abuse of the sick, and uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates cannot be tolerated. If these reports are true, I will have no choice but to initiate an official investigation. Such an investigation could end your career." It was a masterpiece of leadership. Not a reprimand. Not an insult. But a mirror held up to the general, reflecting his actions and their consequences. Eisenhower knew that Patton respected only one thing: strength. And in strength there must also be wisdom. This letter was the test. A special courier was sent immediately. Eisenhower did not trust telegraphs or coded messages. Patton needed to hold the paper in his own hands, to see the signature, to feel the weight of accountability. The letter would not humiliate him publicly, but it would terrify him privately. Back in Sicily, Patton received the letter. He read it slowly, at first with disbelief, then with anger, and finally with something he had never felt before: fear. Not fear of Germans. Not fear of battle. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of losing the command he had lived for his entire life. For a man who had faced artillery, tanks and machine guns without flinching, this was almost unbearable. He realized in that moment that his own actions could destroy him, not the enemy, not the war, but himself. The glory he had chased, the fear he had instilled in others, now threatened to crumble around him like sand. But Eisenhower had not sent the letter to humiliate. He had sent it to correct. He understood Patton. He knew his fury, his obsession, his madness, even if it teetered on the edge of disaster, was also what made him extraordinary. Eisenhower was holding a wolf by the ears. To let go could be dangerous, but to crush him could be fatal. Patton's mind raced. Could he apologize? Could he admit fault without losing his reputation? He hated the thought. Yet he had no choice. The war was bigger than his ego, bigger than his pride. And Eisenhower's calm, steady judgment forced him to confront what he had done. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate among soldiers and staff. The story of the slaps, the threats, the cries, the terror, it was no longer just confined to the tent. If it reached the press, if the public learned, it could destroy Patton's career and shake the morale of the army. Eisenhower knew he had to act quickly and carefully. He needed secrecy, diplomacy, and control. As he put down his pen, Eisenhower leaned back, hands steepled. He had chosen the hardest path: save Patton from himself, protect the army, and keep the war on track. It was a gamble. And the stakes were clear. One misstep and the greatest general of the American army could fall, not to the Germans but to his own temper. Outside, the Sicilian sun blazed. Inside, soldiers wondered who would survive the coming days. But in the offices of Allied command, a different war was being fought, one of judgment, leadership, and the delicate balance between discipline and genius. Cliffhanger for Part 4. Patton must now face the consequences of his actions. He will go on an apology tour, confront his soldiers, and face his own fury. Can a man like Patton be tamed, or is he too wild even for Eisenhower? The letter from Eisenhower burned in Patton's hands. For the first time in his life he felt small. The man who had stood unflinching under artillery fire, who had driven his tanks across Europe like a force of nature, was suddenly terrified, not of the enemy but of his own actions. He knew the consequences of his rage could destroy everything he had fought for. Patton did what no general liked to do. He prepared to apologize. And not in private. Not quietly. He would stand before his soldiers, thousands of men who had once cheered him as a hero, and admit that he had been wrong. The thought of it made his stomach churn. Pride, fury, and fear warred inside him. But he had no choice. Eisenhower had made it clear: apologize or face an official investigation that could end his career. The first stop was his own division. Thousands of soldiers gathered in the blistering Sicilian sun, standing at attention, their faces shaded by helmets, their eyes sharp. Patton climbed the raised platform, feeling the heat of the day and the weight of their gaze. He had no revolvers this time, no symbols of authority to hide behind. He was just a man, and for once he had to face judgment. He cleared his throat. His voice, high-pitched and squeaky, something most men forgot under his usual roar, carried across the crowd. "Man." He paused. The words felt foreign. "I acted in anger. I lost my judgment. I apologize." Some men whispered, confused. Others stared silently. A few, the ones who had seen his fury firsthand, smirked. But the majority were silent, unsure how to react. Patton's apology was like watching a lion bow its head. Humiliation burned him, but he pressed on. "I believed that by striking you I was saving your courage. I was wrong. No man should be treated like that. From now on, I promise to lead with fairness, not cruelty." He stepped down, leaving the platform, hoping his words were enough. It wasn't enough. Not for everyone. Nurses who had watched him strike Private Cool and Private Bennett crossed their arms, glaring. Doctors shook their heads. And the soldiers, some cheered, some whispered, some stared with suspicion. Pride and respect were difficult to rebuild once broken. But Patton had another duty. He had to face the soldiers he had personally harmed. Private Cool and Private Bennett were summoned. Both young men approached him cautiously, faces pale. Patton extended his hands. I am sorry," he said awkwardly, the words heavy in his mouth. "I should not have struck you. It was wrong. I hope you will forgive me." Cool looked at him, blinking. "It's okay, sir," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. Bennett nodded as well. Neither man shouted or celebrated. They had survived, but the memory of Patton's anger would stay with them forever. This marked the beginning of Patton's journey to redemption. It was painful, slow, and humiliating. A man who had defined himself by action and violence had to speak softly, apologize publicly, and show restraint. Every word, every gesture was a test of his self-control. But the war did not wait. Sicily was still burning under the Allied campaign. The Germans were retreating, regrouping, and planning their next move. Patton's men needed leadership, not just apologies. He could not remain weak. His fury had been terrible, but it had also driven men to fight. He needed to channel it, to temper it, not erase it. As the days passed, Patton slowly regained his footing. He visited the hospitals, speaking kindly to wounded soldiers, handing out cigarettes, answering questions. He smiled less often, but when he did, it was careful, controlled, deliberate. He was learning that courage could be inspired by words as well as by fear. Yet there were whispers. The story of the slaps, though officially contained, traveled like wildfire in hushed tones. Soldiers debated whether Patton was a hero or a tyrant. The balance of respect and fear shifted daily. And while Patton tried to control it, he understood that his reputation had changed forever. He had become a man who could inspire greatness and terror in equal measure. Eisenhower watched from afar. The apology tour was working, but only just. He had saved Patton from destruction, but the general had to prove himself again. Discipline had to be restored, and the army had to respect him, not just fear him. This was a delicate operation, a psychological chess game where one wrong move could cost lives and possibly the war itself. And then came the next challenge. Patton's bold, reckless nature was not easily tamed. The army needed him, the war demanded him, and soon he would face the battlefield again. But the lessons of Sicily would not leave him. Rage had almost destroyed him. Apology had saved him. Victory required balance. And yet, somewhere deep inside, the fire of fury still burned. The soldiers of the 7th Army waited, wary, curious. Some had feared for their lives. Some had admired his courage. All knew that when Patton returned to battle, nothing would be the same. And for the generals planning the next stage of the war, one question hung over them like a storm cloud. Could a man who had been humbled by his own rage still become the hero the Allies desperately needed? Cliffhanger for Part 5. Patton's apology is over, but the war is far from over. Back in America, rumors threaten to explode, and the Germans begin to notice the unusual absence of Patton. What will happen when the man known as Old Blood and Guts is silenced at the worst possible time? After the apology tour, Patton was a changed man, or at least he appeared to be. The public and his soldiers had seen his humility, and Eisenhower had managed to prevent a scandal from exploding. But behind the scenes, a more unusual plan was forming. The war was far from over. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of France, and every detail had to be perfect. Eisenhower understood something others did not. The Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied general. They believed in his aggressiveness, his unpredictability, and his ability to strike like a thunderbolt. But now, after Sicily, Patton could no longer be unleashed in the usual way. He had to be contained, but also used. Eisenhower conceived a plan that was both brilliant and cruel. Patton would become a decoy. The man who had been feared, admired, and almost destroyed by his own temper would lead a fake army, a phantom force designed to confuse the Germans and draw their attention away from the real invasion. In England, Patton arrived to command the 1st United States Army Group. On paper, it was massive, 50 divisions, thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft. But in reality, it was largely empty. Inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, wooden barracks, fake radio traffic. Soldiers were actors, engineers, and a few real troops. Everything was a lie designed to trick the enemy. Patton could hardly believe it. The greatest warrior of his generation, now a general of ghosts and shadows. He paced the halls of his headquarters, a man trapped in a gilded cage. He could not fight. He could not lead. All he could do was pretend, while the real invasion forces planned D-Day across the channel. For a man like Patton, this was torment. He had lived for action, for chaos, for the thrill of the battlefield. Now he was a symbol, a bluff, a shadow meant to scare men he could not see. He roared in frustration, but his commands were mostly ignored. There was nothing to command. The inflatable tanks could not move. The empty radio signals could not attack. Patton's genius was being wasted in a theater of deception. Meanwhile, the Germans noticed something unusual. Their spies reported strange activity in England. Massive formations, radio chatter, but no real movement. Could Patton really be assembling a new army for an invasion? They could not believe that the Allies would keep such a genius idle. To them it made no sense. Patton's reputation worked perfectly as a weapon. Fear and uncertainty spread across the German command. While the Germans were confused, Patton suffered in silence. Days turned into weeks. The man who had led the breakout from Normandy, who had raced across France in a storm of tanks and artillery, now walked empty streets, inspected rubber tanks and watched men perform fake maneuvers. The roar of battle was replaced with silence. He was a tiger in a cage, pacing, frustrated, trapped by strategy. Eisenhower watched carefully. He knew the man he held in check was still dangerous but also invaluable. Patton's restraint was temporary. Soon the real war would demand him. For now he had to play the part of the ghost. Patton's humiliation was the price of Allied success. It was a calculated risk and one that weighed heavily on Eisenhower's conscience. Even in this strange exile, Patton's mind never stopped planning. He studied maps, anticipated German movements, and prepared for the day he would strike. Every radio message, every dummy maneuver, every false report became a rehearsal for the real battle to come. Patton was not idle. He was waiting, sharpening his mind like a sword, though it remained sheathed for now. And while Patton suffered, life moved on elsewhere. Soldiers he had slapped in Sicily had recovered, fighting bravely at the front. News of his absence spread quietly, rumors began to circulate, and whispers reached the ears of Allied journalists. Some suspected a scandal, others thought it a punishment, but the full story remained hidden, thanks to Eisenhower's careful control. Yet the tension was palpable. Patton's absence was noticed by the enemy, his silence felt by the Allies, and his own impatience threatened to explode at any moment. The man who had been almost destroyed by his own rage now had to survive his own boredom, a trial even harsher than the battlefield. The Ghost Army worked. German intelligence was convinced that Patton would lead an attack at Pas-de-Calais, drawing divisions away from Normandy. D-Day approached, and the Allies could breathe a little easier, knowing their deception was holding. Patton, meanwhile, endured the ultimate humiliation, to be feared and useless at the same time. Inside the headquarters, Patton's staff walked carefully, wary of his temper. Every day was a test. Could he remain patient, silent, and restrained? Could he endure the idle waiting, the fake tanks, the rubber divisions? Could he trust Eisenhower's plan even while it mocked him? The answer was uncertain. But one thing was clear: Patton would not remain silent forever. The war would call him back. And when it did, the fury, the brilliance, and the sheer force of nature that had terrified soldiers and generals alike would be unleashed once more. Cliffhanger for Part 6. Patton's patience will be tested as D-Day arrives. The Allies need him, the Germans fear him, and he remains a caged storm. When the time comes, can he channel his rage into the battlefield and become the hero the world desperately needs? The waiting was almost unbearable. Patton had spent months pacing the empty streets of England, inspecting rubber tanks, watching actors play soldiers, and rehearsing imaginary battles in his mind. Every day he felt the weight of uselessness pressing down on him. He had survived artillery barrages, tank ambushes, and machine gun fire, only to be trapped in a fake army, silent, idle, and humiliated. Then finally the call came. Eisenhower picked up the phone. "George," he said, "we need you now. The time has come." Patton's blood ran hot. The storm he had contained for months erupted inside him. He was no longer a ghost. He was a force of nature. For the first time in months he had a battlefield, real soldiers, real tanks, real targets. He was free. The Third Army became operational in August 1944. Patton wasted no time. Maps were spread out. Staff officers crowded around. Intelligence reports flew in. But Patton did not talk about holding positions, securing lines, or defensive strategies. He had one goal: attack, always attack, and never stop. "We're not holding anything," he growled. "Let the enemy hold their ground. We are advancing constantly. We will cut their guts out." His staff stared shocked. Such speed, such recklessness, it seemed impossible. But Patton had a premonition, a sixth sense for war. Days before D-Day, he had already ordered preparations, anticipating the battles before they happened. His mind was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. The Germans had no idea what was coming. They expected cautious moves, careful advances, methodical assaults. They had studied the Allies, predicted every maneuver. But Patton was different. He was a storm no one could forecast. Tanks moved at impossible speeds, supply lines stretched thin, and yet, somehow, his forces kept striking, capturing towns before even headquarters knew what had happened. The breakthrough began with Operation Cobra. Patton's divisions tore open the German lines. They did not pause. They raced forward, encircling entire enemy divisions, cutting them off and leaving the Germans in chaos. News of the advance spread like wildfire. Soldiers whispered about the man they had once feared and criticized. Now they cheered. Old Blood and Guts was back. And he was unstoppable. Patton's genius lay not only in his speed but in his unpredictability. He ignored the traditional rules of warfare. Flanks? Supply lines? Logistics? They were secondary to momentum. Every obstacle became a challenge to overcome, every enemy movement a trap waiting to be sprung. He struck fear into the hearts of the Germans, who had expected cautious generals, not a maniac racing across the countryside with tanks and artillery. The Allies watched in awe. The press that had once criticized him now covered his victories. The headlines no longer mentioned the slapping incidents in Sicily. They focused on maps, arrows, and unstoppable advances. Mothers who had written letters condemning Patton now praised him for leading their sons. Victory, fast and brutal, saved lives. A long war would have killed more boys than Patton ever could with his fury. The climax of Patton's return came in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans launched a massive, desperate attack in the Ardennes. Allied lines shattered. American paratroopers were surrounded at Bastogne. Panic spread through command headquarters. Eisenhower called a meeting, grim and tense. "George," he said, "how long will it take to strike the German flank and relieve Bastogne?" Patton's eyes burned. 48 hours, he replied calmly, almost casually. The room laughed nervously. It seemed impossible. Turning a mechanized army through a blizzard over icy roads with 3 divisions? Preposterous. But Patton had already anticipated it. He had prepared while everyone else waited, planned while the storm raged. Within 48 hours, his tanks smashed into the German flank, breaking the siege of Bastogne and reversing the course of the battle. Soldiers who had once feared him now revered him. Patton had returned not as a humble general, but as a force of nature. The speed, the aggression, and the brilliance that had almost destroyed him in Sicily now saved thousands of lives and crushed the German army. And yet, Patton was not satisfied. Victory was never enough. For him, war was action, movement, and conquest. Even in triumph, he felt the hunger for more. He drove his men relentlessly, racing across France, liberating towns, capturing entire divisions. The Third Army moved like a wildfire, unstoppable, terrifying, and brilliant. History would remember him for his speed, his ruthlessness, and his genius. But those closest to him understood a deeper truth. The same rage that had almost ended his career, the same fury that had terrified Private Cool and Private Bennett, was also the very thing that had turned him into a hero. His madness and brilliance were inseparable, 2 sides of the same coin. Patton had been tempered by apology, constrained by strategy, and tested by patience. But when the time came, he returned to the battlefield and became the instrument of victory the Allies desperately needed. Cliffhanger for Part 7. The war nears its end. Patton has achieved glory, but fate has a cruel twist waiting. A moment of peace that should have been quiet becomes Patton's final, shocking test. The war in Europe was finally ending. Patton's Third Army had crushed the German army in France, broken the back of the Wehrmacht, and liberated towns and cities across the continent. Victory was within reach, yet Patton never felt peace. Action had always been his life. Without the roar of artillery, the smell of gunpowder, the rush of speed across the battlefield, he felt trapped in the quiet. By December 1945, the guns were silent. Europe lay in ruins, smoke rising over shattered cities. Soldiers were returning home, civilians picking through the remnants of their lives. Patton, the man who had raced across France like a storm, was no longer a general in motion. He was a man in a world suddenly still. He tried to find purpose in this new calm. On a Sunday he went pheasant hunting with his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay. They drove through the ruined German countryside in Patton's 1938 Cadillac. Patton shifted restlessly in his seat, unable to sit still. He pointed to rusted tank hulls and mangled trucks. "Look at this waste," he muttered. Every vehicle, every broken weapon, reminded him of battles he had fought, victories he had earned, and the lives that had been spent in war. Then the unthinkable happened. A young American truck, moving slowly down the road, cut across the Cadillac's path. The driver did not see Patton's car. The impact was not cinematic, no fireball, no explosion, but it was enough. The Cadillac crumpled. Patton's body hit the glass and snapped back. Pain shot through him, sharp and terrifying. His chief of staff rushed forward. "Are you hurt, General?" Patton tried to move his hands. Nothing. His legs? Dead weight. Breathing? Difficult. "Ah," he whispered, barely audible. The man who had survived artillery, tanks, machine guns, and modern industrial warfare had been stopped by a small truck driving at school zone speed. Irony cut like a blade. He was rushed to the hospital. Tests revealed a brutal truth: his neck was broken. Third and fourth vertebrae crushed. Patton, the unstoppable, the man of action, was now paralyzed. For the first time he could not move. He could not fight. He could not lead. Days passed in agony. Traction hooks were inserted into his skull. Pain became his only companion. He could think, he could see, but his body was useless. The man who had been the terror of the German army was trapped in his own flesh. Even Eisenhower could do nothing but hope for a miracle. Patton's mind, however, remained as sharp as ever. He wrote to his wife, Beatrice. "This is a hell of a way to die," he confessed. He understood that his end was near, that his life as a warrior, a mover of armies, a man of destiny, was slipping away in quiet suffering. History remembered him for the victories, the lightning advances, the battles that seemed impossible. But those who knew him understood the truth. George S. Patton was a man of extremes. Brutal in anger, relentless in pursuit, fearless in combat. He had slapped soldiers, terrified men with his fury, and yet that same violence, that same obsession with victory, had saved thousands of lives and helped end a war that could have lasted years longer. The soldiers he had slapped in Sicily, Private Charles Coole and Private Paul Bennett, lived on. They survived the war, returned home, and lived quiet lives. Yet their stories were forever linked to Patton's. The young men who cried under his anger were part of the brutal calculus of victory, a reminder that war demands sacrifices in ways few can imagine. Patton's final hours came quietly. On December 21, 1945, in a hospital bed in Mannheim, Germany, he whispered to his wife, "It's too dark, it's too late." And then he was gone. The lion of the Allied armies had fallen, not to bullets, not to tanks, not to bombs, but to fate's cruel twist. Yet his legacy lived on. Europe was free, the Holocaust ended in his sector, millions liberated. The men who had once hated him now remembered him as a hero. He had been a monster to some, a savior to others. History itself seemed to struggle with how to judge him. One thing remained undeniable: Patton had been the right man at the right time. His brilliance and madness were inseparable, and together they had helped win a world war. Eisenhower had once held a wolf by the ears. Patton had been dangerous, uncontainable, almost destroyed by his own fury. Yet Eisenhower had known the truth. Sometimes to kill a monster you must unleash a wolf. And that wolf had run across France like fire, terrifying the enemy, saving lives, and leaving a mark on history that would never fade. War is ugly, cruel, and unfair. Patton embodied all of it, and yet he also embodied victory. The man who could strike terror into soldiers' hearts, the man who had been almost destroyed by his own anger, had become a hero. His story reminds us that greatness often walks hand in hand with madness, that courage is sometimes cruel, and that the path to history is paved with the impossible. In the end, George S. Patton died as he had lived, fiercely, unrelentingly, and larger than life. The world had needed him, feared him, and remembered him forever. And for those who study history, his life is a lesson. Brilliance and madness can be two sides of the same coin, and sometimes the most dangerous man is also the most necessary. Closing line for YouTube. So what do you think? Was Patton a hero, a monster, or both? Could victory have been won without his fury? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This story isn't just history, it's a lesson in courage, madness, and the cost of greatness.